To this explainer, we're diving straight into a massive, high-stakes geopolitical chess match that's playing out right now between the US and India. Global markets are literally holding their breath as these two economic giants lock horns over trade. But, this isn't just about boring numbers on a spreadsheet. Not at all. It's a massive clash of cultures, deep historical trauma, and straight-up agricultural survival.
To figure out why India is risking its entire economy rather than giving in to U.S. demands, we're going to connect the dots across 6 key areas: the new tariff war, history of trade protection, the U.S.-China fallout, the PL 480 food crisis, the GMO and dairy trap, and finally, the current standoff.
All right, Section 1, the new tariff war. Let's look at this present-day crisis.
The US has brought out the big guns, slapping a staggering 50% combined tariff on Indian goods. The main goal here? To force India to crack open its highly protected agricultural and dairy markets. It has created an absolute standoff. Neither side is willing to budge an inch. But it really makes you wonder, why use tariffs in the first place? Where did this strategy even come from?
That brings us to Section 2, History of Trade Protection. Because, believe it or not, tariffs are ancient.
Taking a cut from foreign traders has been happening for millennia. Get this, way back in the 17th and 18th centuries BC, rulers in what is now Iraq and Turkey demanded a permission fee called nishatum from passing traders. Much later, Arab traders crossing borders would hand over a list of their goods called a tarif, which is an Arabic word meaning information or notification. And yep, that ancient practice literally gave us the English word tariff. But here's the catch. Unmanaged tariffs can completely wreck the global economy. Back in 1930, during the Great Depression, the U.S. passed the Smoot-Hawley Act to protect local jobs, slapping massive taxes on imports. Well, other countries immediately retaliated, and global trade plummeted by a catastrophic 66%. It was a total disaster. Nations finally realized they needed ground rules. So in 1947, 23 countries, including the U.S. and India, formed GATT to prevent reckless trade wars, which eventually evolved into the World Trade Organization, or WTO, in 1995.
Section 3, the US-China fallout. So, with these rules in place, how on earth did India end up in the crosshairs today? Well, it actually started with a completely different country.
Look at this massive number, $375.2 billion. That was the U.S. trade deficit with China in 2017. When Donald Trump became president, he looked at that massive gap, saw a major loss for the U.S., and made it his primary target. He kicked off a fierce trade war to force China to buy more American goods.
But China didn't just sit back and take it. They expertly struck back by heavily taxing U.S. agriculture, hitting Trump's rural voter base right where it hurts. The impact was brutal. U.S. soybean exports to China literally fell off a cliff, dropping from almost 33 million tons to just 8.2 million tons. This absolutely devastated American farmers, forcing the U.S. government to pay out $28 billion in compensation just to keep them from going bankrupt.
So the huge takeaway here is that opening India's agricultural market isn't just a basic economic move for the U.S., it is about sheer political survival. The U.S. realized they just couldn't rely on China to buy their crops anymore. They desperately needed a massive alternative market to dump their farming output, and India, with over 1 billion mouths to feed, looked like the perfect target. Moving to Section 4, the PL 480 food crisis. Why is India so stubbornly refusing to open its doors to cheap American crops? We have to look at some deep psychological trauma from the 1960s. Back in the 50s and 60s, India was facing severe food shortages. The U.S. stepped in and offered surplus wheat through the PL 480 agreement. It was so incredibly cheap that local Indian farmers just couldn't compete and stopped growing wheat. Fast forward a bit, and India became completely dependent, relying on the U.S. for 40% of its wheat. And the crazy part? Multiple reports from that time called this grain pig grade, literally fit for animals, not humans, but India had no choice. Then, during India's 1965 war with Pakistan, the U.S. actually weaponized this food supply, intentionally delaying shipments to force India to fall in line with U.S. foreign policy.
It was a profoundly humiliating era. Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi repeatedly had to call the U.S. president just to beg for food so her citizens wouldn't starve. After one particularly disrespectful call, she made a fierce vow of absolute food independence. She famously declared that India would never again stretch its hands before any other country for food. And honestly, that vow is the absolute bedrock of Indian agricultural policy today.
Section 5. The GMO and dairy trap.
Let's fast forward to right now and see how this historical fear creates an impossible clash between two totally different ways of farming.
When you compare the two, it is mathematically impossible for a vulnerable Indian farmer to survive a free market. In the U.S., farming is this highly mechanized corporate machine getting billions in government subsidies, making their crops incredibly cheap. For example, U.S. corn costs about 1,700 rupees per quintal. Meanwhile, in India, nearly half the population depends on agriculture, mostly working tiny, non-mechanized family farms. Their cost for corn is 2,400 rupees per quintal. If American crops flood in, Indian farmers would be wiped out overnight.
Plus, the U.S. model is heavily reliant on genetically modified or GM crops. Letting the U.S. in means letting in American GM seeds, and history shows this is a huge trap. Companies like Monsanto charge massive royalties, draining profits from poor farmers. Even worse, GM seeds cross-pollinate and destroy normal local seed varieties, which is exactly what ruined farmers in Mexico and Haiti. And let's not forget, GM crops are completely banned for human consumption in places like the EU and Russia. If India's crops get contaminated, they could lose their lucrative European export markets entirely.
Now, the dairy clash? It's even more intense. The U.S. dairy industry is massive, subsidized, and pumping out milk at 30 to 35 rupees a liter. India has 8 crore, that's 80 million small dairy farming families scraping by on razor-thin 3 to 5% margins, producing milk at 50 rupees a liter. Cheap U.S. milk would instantly bankrupt them. But wait, there's a much bigger issue here. To boost production, U.S. cattle are often fed meat and bone meal and pumped with hormones. This deeply violates India's cultural and religious sentiments, where cattle are strictly kept on a vegetarian diet. Allowing meat-fed dairy into India is a cultural red line the government just cannot cross.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, the current standoff. And man, the deadlock right now is explosive. Since India's government literally cannot afford to anger its massive farming voter base or risk its own food security, they are flat out refusing to open the agriculture and dairy markets. So the U.S. retaliated. First, they slapped a broad 25% tariff on Indian goods. Then, using India's purchase of Russian oil as leverage, they tacked on another 25% penalty. Boom, a completely unprecedented 50% tariff wall against Indian exports.
The stakes are astronomical. To put this in perspective, roughly $48 billion of Indian trade is on the chopping block right now. This 50% tariff threatens huge, job-heavy sectors in India, like textiles, garments, jewelry, and footwear. This isn't just politicians bickering. This is a direct threat to the livelihoods of millions of workers. Depending on how this shakes out, global supply chains could shift permanently.
Right now, India is scrambling to sign free trade agreements with other nations to bypass the U.S. market entirely. So we're left with the ultimate question: who is going to blink first in this trillion-dollar staring contest? Will the crushing economic pressure force India to sacrifice its hard-won food independence, or can they actually survive a 50% tariff wall and rewrite the rules of global trade forever? It's an absolutely fascinating standoff to watch. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the systems around you.